All right, so I had a video planned about historical libertarians this week, but something glitched out with me editing it and with the script and the AI. So I decided instead to talk about how Marxism is slavery. I'm pretty sure I probably said that 500 times on the channel before, but I came across this meme and it made me think of the planks in the Communist Manifesto and maybe just kind of go through that because when I was a communist, of course, I didn't realize I was advocating essentially global enslavement, or at the very least, enslavement of the local populace, so called country, and whatnot. So obviously you can see the meme here. It says, did he miss a page? And really, he didn't miss a page because if you know what the state is and you understand what Marx and Engels were advocating in the manifesto, um, it's obvious that the implications are essentially slavery to the state. So, and I just so I'm gonna post this. I typed it up real quick instead of like showing a video of the manifesto itself because I make these with my phone, so it's just easier this way. But um, well, I guess I could have just screenshotted that, but I really only want to focus on the few things that clearly imply that this would be state slavery. And I know, well, I haven't heard this in a while, but I know communists like to say, well, he was talking about specific situation and et cetera, et cetera. But, right at the beginning of the 10 planks, it says right there is in most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable. So this is more or less the outline of the socialist revolution to implement socialism. And the first one I just threw the bank monopoly in there because it's so ironic and funny to me how every time people want to bring up the Soviet Union to like a really far so-called left communist and a more libertarian type perspective communist, um, they like to say like the USSR was state capitalism. And well, yeah, I mean, what's funny how every time Marxists come into political power, they basically become state capitalists, right? Like you can't really find too many communists who will say North Korea is a good communist state. They're always saying that's not real communism. Well, in their mind, communism is stateless, but it's definitely by definition real socialism. Most of the things that they end up doing, and those are the reasons that the society is so horrible. So, but right there, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and exclusive monopoly. So, I mean, right there, Marx is a state capitalist. Socialism, Marxist socialism is state capitalism. All states, if you're really loose with the terms or you have a specific definition of capitalism, I mean, all states are basically state capitalists because they act like they own everything and they do the things that the communist claims that all capitalists do, which is forcefully expropriate you through number one, taxation, number two, all the other things. Like you can use eminent domain as a example of that. Of course, people say, well, they pay you, and it's like, well, they force you to sell at a price that they set. So, if you force somebody to sell at gunpoint and then give them something for it, it's still extortion, right? Just because you're paying them something, it doesn't change the initial act of the confiscation, the threat to force them to sell. But then, he goes on to say extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. And I know he's not really saying like everybody's got to labor according to a common plan quite yet, but I just wanted to emphasize that because, well, who's going to be improving the soil, right? It's going to be the state workers, which everyone by definition would be under Marxism, because the state is going to monopolize in the industrial sector and the pretty much all production. So equal liability of all to work. That's the most blatant advocacy of slavery to the state, right? Because the state has, as he has already said, they're extending what they own. The state owns factories and instruments of production, and then they're going to declare that everyone has an equal liability of all to work. So that's basically the state deciding at that point, what your work so-called liability is. So they're going to say there's going to be mandatory labor. It doesn't use the word mandatory, but we all know how the state operates. So and saying that somebody has a liability, by definition, it would be justified to collect or enforce that, by force. So, and then establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture and so on. So, um, right there, that one right there is pretty much the most blatant advocacy of slavery. But, it goes on, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. So they're trying to get rid of the division of labor at that point. Gradual abolition of all distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the populace over the country. So basically, what that amounts to is the state's going to take over all agriculture and industrial production. They're going to say everyone has a liability to work, decided by the state, of course. And then they're going to move people around where they say production needs to happen, and have a more equitable distribution of the populace over the country. So they don't want to have, sparsely populated areas, especially if there's farmland that has been developed in accordance with the common plan. If they have the arable land that they want to develop, they're going to have to move people over there to do that if the population is either too low there or they're unwilling. He has some other things too, where it says confiscate the property of emigrants, that's people leaving the country, and rebels. So, um, obviously throwing in rebels, if you don't want to go along with it, they're going to take your property basically. So, which they're, of course because they will distinguish between your houses and productive property, even though that's really ambiguous. Because if you're growing something, if you have a big backyard or like an acre or two and you're growing there, that's productive property. So, we know the Marxists have a very ambiguous view of capital goods versus consumer goods and real estate and things like that. So, but I mean, that basically boils down to, number one, the state's going to take over all the banks, and there's just going to be the one central bank with an exclusive monopoly. And then it's going to extend how many factories it owns, and then it's going to come up with so-called common plans and demand that everybody has a liability to work, and then they're going to try to so-called ensure a more equitable, um, I guess I have a typo there, actually, I just noticed, distribution of the populace over the country. And when you know what the state is, I mean, even if you're a Marxist right now, like reading this, how can you possibly rationalize that as, anything other than slavery to the state? And that's why, the USSR and North Korea and all those are socialist states. They're not, I mean, you can call it state capitalism, and that's fine also, because that's what Marxism is when the state takes over and operates all industry. um, and there's just no way they're going to be able to do that without expropriating you, or without taking the surplus value or whatever, because of course no individual under Marxism is allowed to get too much. They can't accumulate too much, and they definitely can't have capital goods. So it's interesting to me that Marxists don't see that, and a lot of other people really don't either. They might be like, well, Marxism would be okay if it was implemented in some other way or something, but there's really no, this was his political agenda. This was how they were going to put socialism into, um, more agrarian societies, or societies that are developing with industry. And even, it even says in most advanced countries. So Marxism is slavery to the state. He says it right there in the manifesto, and communists want to focus on all this other gibberish that he said, and like Das Kapital and other things that he wrote. But this was the political plan, and Marxist political plan is slavery to the state. I do recognize, of course, they hallucinate or envision, is probably the more polite way to say that, a different type of state that's vastly democratic. But there's always a loser in democracy. So especially if you're just doing strictly majority rule, which most of them seem to advocate that, instead of something like, well, I'll get to that later, but obviously there's always going to be losers in democracy. So you could take over all production and make it as democratic as you want, and it's still 51% of the population expropriating and dominating and enslaving the rest of them. And they could talk about different models like 100% consensus, which is interesting because that's just like an attempt. It seems to go so far into the idea that democracy means consent that it I mean, how would that ever work? Unless you're completely brainwashed or you're the new socialist man and whatnot, then you're never going to have 100% agreement, especially through huge populations. Like, you could try to live like this voluntarily in maybe some, relatively, quote, large groups, relative to like one person. But once you get more and more people involved in production, the chances of you getting 100% consensus is very, very low, just simply because people have different ambitions and desires, and they have different ideas. So even if they're all working with this idea, you're likely to have disagreements the more people you have. That's why I would say Lenin, he eventually came up with democratic centralism, which is basically just acknowledgement that everybody has to be forced to obey the majority. and and that's perfectly fitting with Marxist theory. I know people say Lenin wasn't a Marxist for various reasons, and I think they say that because they envision something more like 100% consensus democracy. But I mean, just imagine how that would work. It would be, you would never get anything done on a so called national scale when you're talking about millions of people, monopolized production, and you need everybody's input and things like that. Hopefully, the more astute Marxists today would still try to kind of so-called decentralize that, or you would only need that democracy to happen in one particular factory, or maybe one particular industry, but that's still thousands and thousands of people that you would need some sort of you would need 100% consensus on, so the chances of that are practically zero. But yeah, these clearly show, I would say, how Marxism is just slavery to the state. If if communists want to call that state capitalism, whatever. I like to say that too, because I like to say, well, Marx was a state capitalist. So if people are trying to institute Marxism as a political agenda, that's what they're going to be, because that's right here what they believe in doing, is just basically having the state be the only capitalist. And that's more or less, even of course, von Mises would have said that, that's not a legitimate capitalist, or not really a capitalist, but of course he addresses that in his writing Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, which is a criticism of the Marxist view of socialism, or more broadly just socialism in general, where the state or whoever monopolizes all of industry. You can't make rational economic calculations because you don't have price inputs. You have nothing to compare to when you're the only provider of literally everything. So definitely we recommend checking that out. But yeah, so that's, I guess, my more long form video this week. Haven't done too many shorts lately the last couple of weeks either, but hopefully next week I will do another historical libertarian one, and I should probably use some of the more libertarian communists too, just for some balance, because I mean, they do have some good arguments. I think their economics just backfire on them because they really didn't understand it. But they're pretty good on the state, most of the old school anarchist communists. But and a lot of them were active in resisting oppression. The more anarchist types. So anyway, yeah, Marxism is slavery.